Hello. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. And I'd like to introduce the Rolling Stones. All these good people here are, huge travelers, occupy different locations, and are in search of chasing and being followed by the global soul. So I'd like to introduce Aminatta Forna, who will steer the discussion. Aminatta is someone I respect and adore, which is a very nice combination. Aminatta, many of you might know her recent novel, The Memory of Love, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And you might also know The Devil That Danced on the Water, that was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize. Aminatta was born in Scotland, grew up in Sierra Leone, and also in Thailand, Iran, Zambia, Britain. So who better than her to take this forward? Over to you.
Are we sorted? Yeah, great. Welcome to the Global Soul. I'm joined on stage by, from my far left, Akash Kapur. Akash is Indian-born and North American and British educated. He's the author of India Becoming, a New Yorker and New Republic Best Book of 2012, and a Newsweek must-read on modern India. He's the former Letter from India columnist for the International Herald Tribune and the online edition of the New York Times. Next to him is Pico Iyer. Pico Iyer was born in England to Indian parents, educated in the United States and Britain, and now lives in rural Japan. He is an essayist and novelist who has written 2 novels as well as 8 works of non-fiction, most recently The Man Within My Head, about Graham Greene and hauntedness. Laleh Khadivi was born in Isfahan, Iran, from where her family fled to Canada in the wake of the Islamic Revolution. She's the author of 2 books, The Age of Orphans and The Walking, the first 2 books in a trilogy that follows 3 generations of Kurdish men who find themselves increasingly displaced as they move through tribal, national, and post-national loyalties. She's at work on the 3rd book and takes California for her home for now. Sadakat Kadri. Sadakat Kadri is born of a Finnish mother and an Indian-born Pakistani-British father. He's a London-based human rights barrister who studied at Cambridge and Harvard. He has worked in several countries, most recently Syria and Myanmar. He's a past winner of the Spectator Shiva Naipur Travel Writing Prize, and his most recent book was Heaven on Earth, A Journey Through Sharia Law. And next to me, on my left, Abraham Verghese was born to Indian parents who were teachers in Ethiopia, the country in which he grew up. He trained as a doctor in Ethiopia, India, and the United States, where he is now Senior Associate Chair and Professor for the Theory and Practice of Medicine at Stanford University. His most recent book, Cutting for Stone, was on the New York Times book list for 2 years. So welcome, Global Souls. We're here the ideas that we're here to discuss really come out of your book, Pico, which was published a few years ago now. I've got a copy, The Global Soul. But the ideas are ever more pertinent. And could you just kick us off with a little brief summary of what a global soul is?
Sure. I'm a little bewildered and horrified that this whole panel is named after my ancient book. But I brought it out in the first month of the new millennium, out of my sense that everybody was always talking about globalization, but nearly always, as I was saying to Akash a couple of days ago in another session, we were talking about global markets or global technologies. And it seemed that if it were really having an effect, it would be at the level of the soul, or the conscience, or the heart. How is globalism causing us to dream differently, to love differently, to make writing of a different kind? And I was just on the way over here talking to somebody in the car and thinking that for all the people on the stage, as you just heard from Aminatta's introduction, the simplest questions are ever more complicated to answer. Notions of belonging and home and what's your community take a lifetime to answer, and you may never actually answer them. And so, in my case, when somebody asks me, where do you come from? You couldn't have a simpler question. But I could say that my ancestry and blood are entirely of Indian, I've never lived a single day of my life in India. I don't speak a single word of any of India's languages. And if where do you come from means where were you born and raised and educated, then I'm entirely of England. But I left England as soon as I finished my education, and I've never been a grown-up there. If where do you come from means where do you pay your taxes, where is your dentist and your doctor, then since the age of 7, I belong to the United States. But for nearly all these years, I've had this funny pinkish card with green lines through my face, calling me a permanent alien. And the longer I'm there, the more alien I feel and the more alien it feels. And, you know, if where do you come from means which place feels close to you, where do you spend the majority of your time? I live in Japan for 25 years now, and yet all those 25 years I've lived there on a tourist visa, and I don't think any Japanese person would be keen to claim me as part of his group. And I don't think I'm interesting, but every one of the others on the stage has much more varied backgrounds than I. And I think if you go to a classroom in a university or school in many of the major cities in the world, the people have even harder time trying to resolve this. So I'll stop talking now, but as I see it, there are two big consequences. The first is, as Aminatta was suggesting, that for more and more of us, I think the notion of home is a movable target. It's a work in progress. It's like a book we're constantly revising and adding to and amending. And in some sense, I think for more and more people, home is not a piece of soil. It's almost a piece of soul. It's the values and friendships and affinities you carry around you. That's what grounds you. And home has much less to do with where you were born than perhaps where you become yourself. I think more and more human beings are turning into snails, carrying their homes with them. And then the other effect culturally is that, of course, our literature, our food, our films, our music is getting so much more exciting and diverse. I remember in the 1980s, started talking about how the empire was striking back, that British literature was being written principally by people whose names most Britons couldn't pronounce. Rushdie, Ondaatje, Kazuya, Ishiguro. Same thing is happening in America now. And I think that's partly the great excitement of modern literature, is that it comes from people from everywhere. So when, for example, I read Abraham's wonderful book, The Tennis Partner, set on the Mexican-American border, part of what makes it so fresh and unexpected is it's not written by a Mexican, or by an American, or by a Mexican-American, but by someone of Indian ancestry who grew up in Ethiopia, has long lived in the US, and at every moment is bringing, I would say, an unprecedented perspective to a familiar issue. So I'll shut up.
I'll pick up on those points because there's a sense that we could all be global souls now, that the world has changed so much, and since you wrote your book, of course, even more so. But let me go back to that question of where are you from, because it's a question I dread, and I've dreaded all my entire life. And it also changes depending on the context you're in. When I'm in India and people say, where are you from? And I say, England, because I just don't want to have the conversation, but I can see that this is not the answer they're looking for. I mean, London sort of works because London is a global city. But I wonder, Abraham, when people ask you where you're from, what do you answer?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I often wind up saying I'm of Indian origin, but I live in California.
You keep Ethiopia out of it, do you?
I'm sorry?
You keep Ethiopia out of it.
I don't keep it out of it, but it becomes a much more convoluted answer. The truth is that I was born in Ethiopia. My heart is very much there. I speak the language very fluently. I can scare the hell out of cab drivers in New York City and Washington, D.C. by speaking to them fluently in their own language. But that said, it was a very bitter moment for me when I had to leave Ethiopia. I felt that my heart was broken, that I had to leave in the midst of a civil war. And there's a part of me that's always a bit sad about that. Other people can claim a hometown, they can claim rituals of Friday night football or possum pie or whatever the rituals are. I really can't claim a ritual of my birthland. But I must say, when I arrive in India, I always have the sense that I recognize that the pulse that's beating in me is Indian. And it colors everything I do. And therefore, it's been very easy to say I'm of Indian origin, but I live in California, which is really a précis of the truth.
This idea of home, of having a home like Ethiopia that you lost and losing all those rituals touches, of course, on Pico's idea of the fluidity of home for those of us who are born on the crossroads of cultures. Akash, this idea of home, where is it? I mean, it's something people like you and I are constantly asked, people on this panel are constantly asked. Why does it, I mean, sometimes I kind of wonder, why it matters to other people so much to discover what we consider home.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a way of placing you. It's an old sort of clan caste thing almost. And I was thinking, when you asked Abraham, what do you answer people when they say where you're from? I find my answer completely depends on the person in front of me. And if it's somebody who can sort of relate to the global condition, then I'll launch into my 10-minute long story about where I'm from. If it's somebody who expects a very simple answer, I'll tell them a very simple answer depending on which place they might know best. So I think there's a kind of chameleon-like quality to global souls. And the other thing I just wanted to say, that really resonated when you talked about the sadness in a way of not having a home. And I think part of the global soul condition is also an exile condition. And that's sort of the less happy side in a way of being a global soul.
Laleh, let me ask you about this idea of home and being asked, where is your home? Does everybody need a home?
I think everybody needs a definition of home for themselves personally. And I feel like that definition for me has rotated as I have grown more mature and more sophisticated and more comfortable with being a global soul. Because at first that definition is passports. It is defined for you by states and airports and sort of agencies. And then the definition becomes a social one. And you are at a party and somebody asks you where your home is and they are trying to clan and tribalize you. And then the definition has to be something that you make for yourself, because it is not a house anymore, and it's not an address, and it's not necessarily a community. You're in flux all of the time. And I have taken personally, and I know told you I wouldn't talk about bird migration, but I am going to talk about bird migration. I have taken for myself the more biological definition of home among species, because we are all in migration as people on the stage. And the world largely is becoming a migratory place for humans. And if you look at this definition of the home range, for a certain type of bird, it's every place they have ever slept is their home. And once I realized that that was a possibility for a definition of home, I relaxed. My home is more or less the Northern Hemisphere, and it kind of absolves me of having to put myself in one of those boxes for someone else to understand me. Because as long as I can define it, I'm not so interested whether you can.
So Pico, how many homes would that give you if every place you've slept is a home? How many homes would you count?
Yeah, not so many, but one thing I love is that the whole notion of community is changing, and we all essentially belong to the same home, the same community. And for example, you, half from Scotland, half from Sierra Leone, probably have much more in common with Akash, half from America, half from India, than from anyone entirely of Scotland or entirely of Sierra Leone.
Yes,
and what excites me is that there's a whole new mobile tribe forming.
Well, I wonder, and actually the bird migration is a sort of perfect, I'm going to definitely steal that. Because I wonder when people ask me and insist upon an answer about where are you from and where do you call home, whether we're really talking about their anxieties, not mine.
Yeah.
Since I haven't actually ever felt this to be a problem to me. And I wonder, and what do you feel about that, Sadakat? I'm thinking, actually, because you're a human rights lawyer, Slavenka Drakulic, the Yugoslav, of the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, wrote about Istria, and she was saying that people of Istria who live on the borders of Italy and Croatia call themselves Istrian, and they won't choose whether they're Croatian or Italian. And of course this became quite a problem during the war. And she says that the question, who are you from, when asked in peacetime is quite benign. But ultimately what somebody is asking is, am I one day going to have to kill you?
Yeah, no, I think it's actually an incredibly important question, where one's home is. I grew up in, okay, I'm going to use these. Better? Yeah. Yeah, I think the question of where one's home is an incredibly important one. I was born in London and grew up in London. As you've heard, my mother is from Finland. My father, born in India, but then moved to Pakistan after partition, spent about 10 years there and then moved to London. But even though I was born in London, I spent all my life in London, traveling around and doing a lot of international work and writing about international subjects. For me, finding out where I was from was important since as long as I can remember. And I grew up in the 1970s in England, particularly, where racism was an incredibly important issue, and whether I liked it or not, I was being presented, well, I was being forced to confront the issue of where I was from. I desperately wanted to say that I was from England at that point. I wanted to say, look, I'm born here. Where else can I be from? I almost wanted to deny my ethnic background. But I couldn't, and as a result of that, the subcontinental aspect of my background became much more important, because I wasn't being vilified or called names on the street because of my Finnish background. It was because of my subcontinental background. And for me then, it didn't matter. Indian, Pakistani, it didn't matter. I mean, and for most immigrants, the immigrant experience, the South Asian immigrant experience in London was the same. It was colour that was important. I really wanted to have a home at that point. I took comfort in the idea of London, as you've mentioned, because London has always been regarded as a melting pot. And as I've got older, I've felt more comfortable, increasingly comfortable, about the idea of saying, well, I suppose I'm British. I'm a Muslim, but I'm British of Indian, Pakistani, Finnish origin. But this notion that we are all of the same tribe, the global soul tribe, it's a nice romantic notion. I'm not sure how true it actually is. I mean, it's certainly the case that over the last 20, 30 years, more and more of us have had access to global goods and knowledge about the way that other people do things in other countries, and more of us have been moving from place to place. But I think that the notion that one can just be a rolling stone it's a luxury, which depends on having access to time and to money, and to invitations to literary festivals like this, for example.
Well, let me just move on, because some of us, of course, are born global souls or choose to become global souls, but some of us have global souldom thrust upon us. Refugees, for example, you know. So it is a privilege for some of us who choose it, but for other people, they become global souls not by chance. I mean, by chance.
Sure. Well, they're forced to confront they're forced to confront challenges in different countries. If that's what being a global soul means, then yes, that's certainly true. And what I think, I mean, I do think it's important as part of this discussion to recognise that that the notion of home has become very important to people over the last few years. It isn't simply a case. I remember about 20 years ago, I think in fact it was even in Goa. I was talking to someone, and he or she was, it was a she, that's right, I remember now. She was saying that that in a few years' time, we would all be, everyone would be doing exactly the same thing, because the world was just homogenizing. All it takes is to mention the word 9/11 to realise that isn't the case. Since over the last decade, the importance of home, the importance of identity has become hugely important, and people have clung on, have fallen back to old ideas of nationalism and old ideas of identity.
Let me bring in Abraham and Akash about this from the perspective of the United States, because of course your president is a global soul who has been forced to play down his global souldom for exactly the reasons that Sadakat is talking about.
I think in my case you're right, that sometimes the global soul is thrust on you. I'm a big believer in the phrase that geography is destiny. I was actually taught that in medical school as something that Freud said. Freud said that geography is destiny, speaking of the proximity of the birth canal to all the interesting organs nearby. But it turned out that Freud never said that. It was actually Napoleon who said that. But it's actually been a hugely important phrase in my life. My parents were born in Kerala. Because they moved to Ethiopia, their destiny changed completely. Because I was born there, I was sort of thrust into one kind of global soul because I grew up there. And then when Civil War came and I had to leave, my geography changed and my destiny changed. So I think we have to give a lot of credence to geography and the role it plays in destiny. I do want to say parenthetically that one of the great revelations for me, leaving Ethiopia and going to America, as a physician, was to find that the liver is still on the right side and the spleen on the left side, and that it was somewhat reassuring to find that people and disease and humanity and the need to connect were sort of universal, and they transcended nationality. In many ways, the lesson of HIV was very much that all prejudice was trumped by family and by love and by the sort of the universal compassion one feels. So I don't get too caught up in this, because I'm more reminded of our universality than I am of our differences in my day-to-day job, at least.
Akash, what do you think about the feeling of global souls in America, picking up on Sadakat's idea of 9/11 and the idea of home being ever more important? Abraham says he feels quite comfortable, but how does the American sense? Because from our perspective, looking at how Obama is so obliged to play down his international credentials, how does it feel there?
You know, when you just mentioned Obama earlier, one of the things I thought, one of sort of the defining features of a global soul is, I mean, I don't really, it's hard for me to think of Obama as my president, because you don't know what country you belong to. So when you refer to Obama as my president, I thought, he's not my president. I mean, half of my soul is American, but half of my soul is very Indian, and I live in India. So I guess that's a short way of saying, other than saying I admire Obama and I recognize his globalism, I don't really have much to say about Obama per se. I was thinking about when you were talking about global souls being thrust on people's identity. I think another interesting concept is that often people have localism and local souls thrust on their identity. I mean, I certainly grew up thinking I was going to live a much more globalized sort of jet-setter life than I do. And I hate to be the voice of sort of dull bourgeois conservatism, but you start approaching middle age, you have kids, sort of reality hits you. I mean, I'm pretty local, frankly, right now. Pico was talking about the distinction between soil and soul. My soul might be local, but my soil is pretty firmly fixed in place, getting my 2 kids up in the morning and getting them to school and coming back home.
Sorry, I for some reason thought you lived in the States, no?
No.
Oh, not your president then, definitely not your president.
But it is interesting, because I did live there, and I am half American, but it's hard to relate to sort of a political system as yours when you're a global soul.
Let's switch over actually and talk a little bit about about being a global soul. What's good about being a global soul? I mean, one of the things that I find good about being a global soul is that as a woman, I came under the control of neither group. Neither the Sierra Leoneans wanted to claim me for their own and make me adhere to conservative norms in that society, certainly nor did the Scottish. Are there ways that being a global soul actually makes you freer, Laleh?
Yeah, I completely agree with you in terms of being a woman. My life in Iran, had I stayed, would be a completely different creation than my life as a refugee and then, a resident of the United States. To go back to Iran, what I am reminded of every time that happens is that my soul belongs neither there nor in the United States, but some open, free space in between, where I'm given more permission to define myself as a woman and as a citizen and as an artist. And that's money in the bank, And
what about as a writer, are you aware of how it impacts on your writing?
How what?
Are you aware of how your background, your globalness, your cosmopolitanism impacts on your writing?
I don't think I could write the books that I write if I hadn't grown up the way that I grew up. Every single moment that I have lived accumulates in those works, because you have to draw so heavily on experience and the subconscious and dreams. And all of my nights of sleeping in various countries and geographies has only built this great library in my head from which I draw every time I go to fiction, sometimes so heavily that I wonder how men and women who live in the same town their whole life write. How did Faulkner do it? And then I realized he had his own sort of techniques.
Well, you said to me earlier on when we were having a discussion about this that you'd become interested in the stayers.
Yeah.
The people who don't go anywhere.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated. And having explored migration so deeply in fiction, I'm doing the opposite and trying to understand, why don't some people leave? I'm envious of them. Like the bombs in Syria are falling and they stay. Their livelihood is at stake, and as a species, our goal is to, continue our lives and procreate, and yet they hold to their land. And the Kurds, which I write about a lot, are the same way.
Pico, can I come back to you? I feel I've neglected you. I said to you.
I think so.
What do you think about the stayers? Have you thought about stayers as well as global souls?
Yeah, I mean, I think for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. The more internationalism there is in the world, the more there'll be tribalism and nationalism. And we've seen in the last 20 years, it's not as if borders are going away. They just get constructed in new forms. And I think to go back to your question of Laleh, the good thing about being a global soul potentially is that the President of the United States, we hope, can see things through the eyes of an Indonesian, a Kenyan, and a Hawaiian. The bad thing is, as you so perfectly said, the rest of America hasn't caught up and is threatened by that very, very vision. And I loved what Sadakat was saying about how, I mean, I think part of the test maybe is how homesick are you? The vast majority of people living in countries not their own were propelled out of them against their wishes and are longing to be back home. We all here are people of privilege whose, thanks to our parents' movements, have access to many cultures. But we speak for a very tiny minority, and we probably don't suffer homesickness. But
Oh, that's true. No, I don't. But that could also be 12 years at boarding school. I'm going to come to questions quite soon, but let me ask each of the panel just to look forward 15 years, should we say? Do you think we will be more global or more local? Let me start with you, Akash. Will the borders come down or will they open up?
I have to be first, right? You know, I think we didn't really talk about technology much, but I do think, I mean, it can be overdone, but I do think that technology enables a kind of global soul aspect to people's lives, even while their actual day-to-day lives are very local. So I was saying earlier that I find my life revolves a kind of bourgeois day-to-day routine fixed in place, but it's not really true, because then that's my physical life, and then I come back and I get on my computer and I'm interacting with people everywhere in the world, and you know, it's more than just interaction. You're in their mind space and they're in your mind space. So to the extent, the short answer is that to the extent that technology keeps sort of penetrating deeper and deeper into the world, I do think that people will become more global and globally connected in that way.
So there could be an interconnectedness without actual movement.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I say, I've seen that in my life. When I was younger, I would actually go back and forth more between the US and India, but each time I was in either geography, I was very cut off from the other geography. You know, I would come to India and sort of lose the United States for months, whereas now that just doesn't happen anymore, for better and for worse, but it doesn't happen anymore.
And Pico, of course, your book is so much about cities, and that in one city you can have everything, you know, the cuisine, the culture of multiple nations. Is the answer going to be stay at home but be global?
yes, but the challenge is, I think, the divide between city and country in almost every nation is really getting exacerbated. So we think now the world's less defined by east versus west or north versus south than between city and rural. I think that the world is definitely going to get more global with each generation. I remember somebody in San Francisco once said to me, there's no way you can hate your grandchild. And each time somebody marries across a racial divide, one hopes that's going to erode at least a few of the prejudices. As you said, we can step past our grandparents' enmities in potential.
Laleh.
The question again, 15 years?
15, 20 years, will we be more local or more global?
I
Or a bit
think
of
that
both?
the sort of tension is the Chinese finger lock. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but as you pull, it holds your fingers closer together. And I think that as we become more global and as sort of the bourgeois or privileged classes have access to
mic.
this, have access to this sort of larger scope of the world, then there will be a reaction. And localization and sort of what we see in fundamentalism will make its voice heard as well, because they will have less in common. And I do think that the technology that we are able to interact with on a daily basis is going to make us more local, assuming we have access to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the answer's in the question. I mean, is it going to be better or worse in 15 years? I think it's going to be a bit of both. The technology is, I think, absolutely crucial. The fact that people are able to communicate with each other, exchange ideas, is obviously going to benefit some people. It's going to ideas, but it's also going to enable people to do bad things. I mean, that's just the experience that it's almost inevitable. I mean, one knows that about technology. It's value neutral in that sense, and I certainly think that one ought to be optimistic, but I don't think that one should be at all. There's any space for complacency about the idea of globalization. Globalization can be a very, very dangerous thing, I think, and it's true that one doesn't hate one's own grandchildren, but I think that one can very easily hate other people's grandchildren, and when lines get eroded, the people who belong to the settled communities quite often get very, very angry about the fact that the lines are being eroded, and for them it's anathema, and it becomes all the more important to establish those lines. And I think it's very, very important for people of goodwill to work against that, because that is one of the greatest challenges that we face over the next few years.
I'm actually generally an optimist, but I'm actually looking ahead 15 years. I'm a little pessimistic, because if I think of the forces that made us move in the first place, they were always economic. My parents moved for better opportunities. We left for America for the same reason, better opportunities. And I worry that the economic divide between the haves and the have-nots is becoming bigger in many, many ways. The burden of disease is very different from one nation to another, and the forces that propel people to move are not going to be for globalization. They're moving for desperation. They're moving to have their children have a chance, a stake in this life. And for that reason, I think the barriers, at times I worry that the United States will literally put up barriers all around, because many people, see that as the place for them to get over some of the things that are hard in their own nation. So,
well, that's what I'm thinking about more local. Britain is, there's a discussion about a referendum to leave the EU, and the touch point subject is, of course, the immigrants from the EU going to Britain. And this goes back to Sadakat's point about, the settled people not wanting the lines to be eroded.
Yeah, I think that, again, I can't look into the future, but I suspect that globalization will make people very aware of opportunities elsewhere, will create huge driving forces making people want to migrate, and will also create huge forces trying to resist that. And I can't see where all that's going. I'm not that optimistic.
Back to the Chinese finger test. All right, audience, it's your turn. Can we, lots of questions? Where's the mic? Okay, let's go anyway here to the lady, right in front of you in the striped top.
Hi, my question is open to the entire panel, because I assume that almost like everybody is at least bilingual on the panel. And I would like you to throw some light on the idea of language being integral to the idea of homeland. Now, in the process of globalization, we see that many languages, they are superseded by some other. So the entity, the physical entity that we call home or homeland, that may remain static, but the dynamics around it, the language, the literature around it gets changed. So what is it that you would like to say on?
That's a great question. Let me give it to Pico.
No, because I'm the only
who's not bilingual in his own.
I'm the only non-bilingual person here, I think. And so I've always felt that the English language is my homeland. That's the one constant with every breath that accompanies me through my life. And I think one microcosm of everything we're discussing is we all know that there are fewer and fewer languages in the world. More and more people are speaking English, but they're speaking ever more different forms of English. So instead of 6,000 different languages, we have 6,000 forms of English now. And I think if you have a Bolivian, a Mongolian, and a Norwegian on the stage, and they're all speaking English, they may still be speaking at cross purposes as much as so again, it's another way of saying that the divisions don't go away. But certainly I define myself through my language, because it's all I can hold to as I move from place to place.
You want to say that?
I just want to add one thing to that, which is the idea of nationalism originally, back in the 18th century and the 19th century, was a linguistic idea. I mean, before then, countries would form perhaps around religious identity. Well, not perhaps. I mean, they did form around religious identities and leaders who between groups which effectively would quite often share the same religion. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, it did form around languages. I mean, we're in one of the big exceptions to that. I mean, India is obviously a country of a vast number of languages. Pakistan has got a large number of languages. Even England, even the United Kingdom has got a large number of languages. So there are exceptions, but the question of language has not gone away, and the question of particularity hasn't gone away. I mean, I was just at a session yesterday where there was speculation about what might happen with Balochistan in Pakistan, and that's again, it's obviously pumped up by economic grievances, but language is incredibly important, and I think that's another aspect of peculiarity which may become more important in years to come.
Laleh, how is your Farsi? And
Bad Nist.
do you feel that it connects you to a diaspora, to a cultural diaspora that otherwise wouldn't be the case?
Yes, to a degree. And I really agree with what you say about English being a home, and in that sense, language being a home unto itself. And just the other day, I was in a parking garage in California, and I ran into an Iranian man, and we started to speak Farsi to each other, and it was as if someone had built a house around us, that as soon as we walked away from each other, the house fell apart. Because in that moment, there was just this common understanding. But as a writer, what I am most fascinated about is this idea that languages are leaking into each other. And so what does that mean for the global soul? Like in the United States, Junot Diaz puts a book out that's half in Spanish, and not even Spanish that is like in your textbook, but Spanish that is spoken by Dominicans only. And this book wins the Pulitzer Prize, and it's a book in English. And I find that beautiful. If languages continue to leak into each other, we will be forced to make these small homes across them and understand each other. And in California, it's very typical for a white American to say adios or gracias because that border is permeable. And I think language is a very hopeful place for the global soul.
Abraham, did you want to say anything? Great. There's a lady there in a pink shirt.
So, thank you. One of the things I've noticed traveling a lot myself is one of the unfortunate thing about the preponderance of global souls is when they get together in these places, they then don't go outside and discover the local. You get somewhere, you find the other global souls, and they all sit down and talk to each other and are very comfortable in their globalness and don't spend as much time actually having to interact with the local cultures, actually immersing themselves in the local cultures. And I'm only 23, but even in the last 5 years, the dramatic increase I have noticed in that, I find that troubling. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Are you talking about global souls or expats? I think they're kind of different.
Global souls, not just expats.
Who wants to take that? Silence on the panel. No, come on, let's have a go at it. Yeah, Pico.
I think the reason people go to Ladakh or Iceland or whatever is there's a particular fascination and an increasing uniqueness to those places that are very deeply rooted in their own culture. And I think whether you're local or global, you still feel that same pull. In fact, I think global souls like us probably especially fascinated by people who stay in one place. You said that, weren't you?
Yeah. Let's hear from a gentleman this time. There's a gentleman back there in a black jacket.
Thank you. My question is, in around 2008, after the crash, people stopped asking, what do you do? Because the answers got longer and longer. I'm traveling, I'm going back to school, anything to not say I'm jobless. So my question is, how much, when you're asked where you're from, how much of this literature of global soul is to avoid just saying you're homeless?
I think we'll give this to the bird migration expert.
I'll be very brief. I think that all of it, thank you for calling us out, but I don't like the term homeless. I think that we are beyond others in some direct ways, home full. We are required to construct home over and over and over again, and in doing so, it becomes a richer experience to be on the planet. We are missing a lot of things, don't get me wrong. To watch a particular plot of land change over 50 years is not an experience I'm going to be able to have. But the language that we use for global soul is a way to say, A, back off if you're not going to be nice, and B, like, our experience is different, but it is part of the experience of being a human on this planet.
Want to answer?
I mean, I don't know. I think that it's probably one of those, you know, glass half full, half empty situations. I could look at my condition as either being homeless or homeful, as you say, and I think that the answer about the language you use to describe your home, as I said earlier, really depends on the person you're talking to. And I don't particularly feel like I don't have a home, but you know, somebody else might feel I'm not rooted enough in another culture, in any particular culture, and they probably have a point too.
Somebody did say to me, people like you who don't belong anywhere. And I said, well, I felt fine until you said that. Another question, let's go a bit further back. Let's go to the left-hand side where we haven't had a go. There's a gentleman there and he has a red sweater on.
Thank you. My question is that I moved just 400 kilometers in the state of Rajasthan, India itself. Still, I miss the food cooked by my mother. So am I not a homeless person? Should I need to move to USA or Britain to become a homeless person?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think, you know, any sort of move, even 400 kilometers, is a significant one. I must say that I resisted the question about being homeless. I feel far from homeless. I have a birthland. I'm very proud of it. The fact that I was dislocated is another story. I was educated in India. I'm very proud of that fact, of the years I spent in Madras learning medicine. And I now live in America, and I'm an American citizen. Very proud of that fact too. Very, you know, very significant moment of my life was taking the oath of citizenship, feeling that this was a nation that accommodated someone like me, born here, grew up there. And so my home right now in California is a place that is full of artifacts of my different pieces of my being. My food is very much the ritual of all the places I grew up, the rituals of my day-to-day life, the way I, you know, tell my children stories are all conditioned by these various places. So I don't feel homeless, and I think when we move, we carry those pieces with us. We never entirely get rid of them, and I completely empathize with what you're saying about missing your brother's cooking and so on.
Can I add something? I really like what you said, because I think that there is a tendency among so-called global souls or people who have multiple homes to sort of feel ashamed of it. And when you get asked where you're from, as I was saying earlier, that's a tribal question, and there's that you tend to feel inauthentic, and there's a sort of a tendency to try to place yourself in a place that you don't necessarily belong. And as you were saying the other day in our discussion, it can, you know, try to look at the positive aspects of being a global soul and not just feeling the exile or the lack of rootedness. And that's something that I'm still working on, but I like the positive affirmation.
Where's the mic? Let's keep moving backwards. There's a gentleman there with sunglasses and a checked shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. How would the panel react to the charge that in the most literal sense, being a global soul is a privilege of a Western passport holder? In the sense that as an Indian passport holder, I'm not even very welcome in very many places. I can't even have a spontaneous itinerary if I go to a place like Europe.
Oh, actually, we should have a passport count up here. You're quite right. I have 3 passports, and I can tell you that I very rarely use my Sierra passport to go anywhere. Let's put it to the panel. Pico, is this a condition of having at least one passport that is Western?
Well, I'm less concerned with passports. I think if you're an Indian citizen, you're part of this amazing continent with so many languages, cultures, as far apart as Sweden and Greece are. You don't need to travel the world. There's so much, there's so much diversity within India and each of its cities that you've been born heir to an extravagance and embarrassment of riches culturally.
So you're saying, what's he complaining about?
Yeah, yeah.
But more seriously, Sadakat, can you pick up that idea of...
Well, I'll quite happily accept the premise. I think it is conditional on being able to move. It's not conditional. I mean, there are many aspects of the things that we've been talking about which are fairly universal. I mean, people who emigrate for whatever reason are being internationalized. They're being exposed to different communities and to different values, and they're having to face those challenges. But if one's talking about people who do it out of choice, who take the best from different places, who roam around at will, then of course that's dependent on not just having a Western passport, but having the means, the economic means to do it. I mean, I would just say in relation to the Indian passport question, I was talking to a friend of mine in England a month ago who was going to Iran, and I said to him, how on earth did you get a visa? It's almost impossible at the moment to get a visa because of the whole nuclear standoff. We said, no, the Iranians just absolutely love the Indians. They give us a visa, no problem. And I'm sure that's not true, but it's certainly easier to get a visa to go to a place like Iran than it is to get one if you've got a British passport. So there are advantages probably to having an Indian passport.
Let's go a little to the back because we haven't. There's a lady with her hand up. She has sunglasses on. Yeah.
Hello. I'm from Canada. My father is native Indian. My mother is white. I lived on the reserve for the first few years of my life, and then we moved to the city. I'm in some ways, in that small local community, a global soul. I had an education. I've traveled around the world. I try to consider myself a bridge and an example to other people, even in my local area, who don't move around. So do you feel that you have any kind of duty to sort of be an example to others of a new way of being in the world?
Who wants?
I have a follow-up thought to the question about passport. I just want to point out that being an Indian is probably the #1 criteria to be a global soul.
Yeah.
As I travel around the world, I'm struck by how, despite passport situations, we've managed to get to every country in the world. I was in a so I would say, far from being a drawback to be of Indian origin, this sort of enlargement of our diaspora is in our blood, is in our genes. And I landed up in Brazil and was walking down a side street and heard someone speaking Malayalam. And amazingly, they had found their way there, and the absence of a visa and a passport did not stop that soul. So I just want to follow up on that thought before I finish.
The global soul will out. Sadakat?
Yeah, I mean, I'm loath to accept the idea that I've got a duty to do anything, but I do think that that if you are half and half, as I am, there's certainly there's a sensibility, I think, which comes with that. And I mean, in my own experience, I mean, what it's meant is that I often find myself, when I'm writing, and most recently with the book that I wrote about the Sharia, having to, or I found myself imagining the situation from both sides, because of course, I mean, I come from a Muslim background, but I've got plenty of non-Muslim relations, and I live in a country which is predominantly non-Muslim, so I'm perfectly aware of in many ways I'm more aware of the non-Muslim sensibility than the Muslim sensibility, and I thought that it was very, very important that I reflect that in my writing, and so when I wrote that particular book, I was very conscious of the fact that I was addressing at least two audiences, the non-Muslim and the Muslim, and there's plenty of audiences within that as well. And we were talking earlier on about Barack Obama. I think that one of the plus points, as well as the minus points of his first presidency, at least, was the extent to which he did compromise across political boundaries as well. I know there have been plenty of areas, I mean, thinking particularly of drone attacks, where he hasn't compromised. But in terms of addressing people from different sides of the political spectrum, I think that that's got something to do, very, very much to do with his background and with the fact that he has grown up seeing many different sides of the same question.
I think we all on this panel see ourselves constantly culturally interpreting, don't we? I happen to see it as a privilege, though. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say, I mean, you know, I definitely don't think of myself as having a duty to teach people how to be a bridge, because I think that's an incredibly grandiose idea to have. What I would say is that if you are sort of globalized and if you come from many worlds, you naturally learn tolerance and acceptance of difference. And I think that's a duty that anybody, not just a global soul, even a very local soul, has to teach to other people. I mean, it's a value that I would like to impart to my children, and I try to teach them that every day, but I don't think that that's specific to being a global soul. It may be something you learn from being globalized, though.
I'm going to take one more question. Do you want to say something quickly about that one?
Very quickly. Can I very quickly stitch the last two questions together and say, if you come to India from America, the first thing you notice is Indians know much more about America than Americans know about India. In America, it's wonderful that my neighbors are as cosmopolitan as Abraham and Laleh. On the other hand, I'm living in a country where 7 out of 10 people don't have a passport, and our past president had only been to 2 nations when he became president. So I think America is very grateful for people bringing the news from elsewhere, and we do have a duty to be messengers from elsewhere.
There's a lady here who's been trying to catch my eye for 5 minutes. Come to her. And they're in a black sweater at the front. And I'm afraid this is going to be the last question.
Thank you. My question is, all of you talk of the global soul from an individual perspective, but how do you see that it affects the family, like the family as we know it? Do you find that it weakens ties or it strengthens the ties? For example, in India, we all have a system of living with our parents and taking care of them. That seems to be eroding now with all the globalization.
Very good question.
Well, I think, I mean, our children are even more further hybridized, if you will, than we are. So I have 2 sons who are Indian and 1 son who is half Indian, half Mexican American, and I watch them with great awe and wonder as they make their way through their life. They've been blessed to a certain degree in a way that I have not, by having had a hometown, having had cities that will define them, and having had rituals. But what part of these various cultures they will draw on, and to what degree they will celebrate the values that I celebrate, is sort of a mystery. And yet it's a wonderful experiment. I can't wait to see what the alchemy brings, and I certainly feel no need to try and define it for them.
What about you, Akash, because you're raising children?
I think it's a really good question, and I think, you know, the short answer is I think that the global condition is very hard on families, actually. I mean, I see my family now being incredibly dispersed around the world, and although my children are only 4 and 6, I live in terror of them growing up and moving to like Greenland or Siberia or wherever, you know, wherever they'll move to then. So I think it's a great question, yeah.
Laleh?
I agree. I also think that it's a very powerful question, because I grew up in transit with my family, and we would arrive in a place and be the only people we knew. So in that sense, our particular nuclear unit was even stronger than others. But our extended unit has decayed over time, and women and men in my extended family that I had known as a child, I know less and less, especially now that travel between Iran and the U.S. is so incredibly limited. So you have this sort of letting go of connections, and you feel less bound to the larger family unit, which is both tragic on one hand and liberating on the other.
Great. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm really sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much for our audience. Some great questions. Thank you very much, and goodbye from Global Souls.
Thank you so much, Aminatta, for that.
Homeful. Lovely. I'm going to steal it.
Someone in the audience, Kamla Basin, a poet herself, listening to this session, perhaps inspired by Faiz, said, "I live in my heart, the world is my home." So, wah wah.